This is the thing I was talking about earlier. The objectives are labeled as either an observer or a pilot squitter. What's called the MART, the Mission Aircrew Reference Text, which is also available on the NISA website, is a great reference to keep around if you have questions about details of a particular task. That's a good place to find that information. These are the tasks we're going to go through. Talk about the audio panel, recognize the stuck mic, which can be a problem. Talk about the radio reports that are minimally required. We'll talk about in-flight services, which is more rare these days, but still important, especially on longer flights. PIREPs are important. Be in the habit of providing them where we can. Quick word about aircraft call signs. This is on the airband radio only. The FAA, when you're using this CAP call sign, they want you to use numbers in group format, which is different from how we want you to do it on the CAP radio side. Those of you who fly with a tail number, you'll know you say all the digits separately. When flying under a CAP call sign, you can use this group format, which is 4239 is the example that they give. In California, all of ours start with 4, so it's things like 418, 481. The point is that's okay to do. It's up to you whether you actually want to do it. What I've found is, especially new observers will get to Mock Monkey. They'll hear the pilot say it to air traffic control, and then they'll say it on the base radio. On the base radio, we really want you to pronounce each digit. We're also authorized to use the rescue prefix, which can at sometimes result in better handling from air traffic control. Sometimes on a busy day, you may not get the routing that you're looking for. If you're actually on a search and rescue mission, prepending rescue to your call sign may give you priority handling. The controller will know, he may have to give us bad routing, and he'll ask, are you on an operational mission or not? And if you say, no, we're just training, then you get normal priority handling. Do not abuse this. Obviously, do not do this during SARXs. Do not do this during proficiency flying. This is just for actual operational missions. Okay, the audio panel is an important piece of gear in the aircraft so that the two folks up front can coordinate the use of the radios. We have, on the older aircraft, the 182Rs, we have an older audio panel that looks kind of like this. Fortunately, there are several minor differences between all of them. And so your best bet is, if you're about to fly in a plane that you haven't flown in before, take an extra minute to review the audio panel that's in place on that aircraft. They work slightly differently. They have slightly different. The problem is we have 500 aircraft. They bought 500 of these, but not all in the same year. They bought 75 of them, and then a year later bought another 75. And in between, they gave feedback to the company that made actually a custom panel for us for use by CAP. And so some upgrades have happened. Also, we have some aircraft where over the years, there's been some damage. I know of at least one aircraft that has an audio panel that's wired incorrectly, and I don't think there's any chance we're going to get that fixed. And so Semper Gumby applies, be forever flexible. The audio panels are all kind of the same. They have the same functionality. The important aspects of it are the on-off and volume control. In this case, it's the on-off and volume is the far left lower corner. The microphone selector switch and receiver switches. The idea here is that you can choose which of the various comm channels will be used when you key up the microphone, and then you can additionally listen to other channels. The important thing here is that the mic selector implies that you're going to listen to the receiver. And so when you change one of these selectors to set which channel the microphone is going to use, you're also changing which channel will be listened to on your headset. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. There's a thing called split mode where different things happen in the left seat than the right seat. There's also a swap mode for pretty rare combinations. Basically, the idea is that you've got the left side and the right side set up and you can swap them. Pretty rare but in this case, there's a swap button over in the lower right-hand corner. There's an intercom so that everyone can talk without transmitting on the radio. Usually those are voice activated. So the 4 push buttons on the left-hand side of this panel that are labeled COM1, COM2, NAV1, NAV2, they show which channels are being listened to. Over on the right-hand side, the mic selector says which channel will be transmitted on when you key up the radio. In this case, I don't know if you can see this very well. The indicator is pointing at the COM1 line, which means that both seats would transmit on COM1. This is not the normal thing we do in a CAP mission. What we normally do is 2 to the right on there, which is COM1 and 3. This is what's called split mode. The idea is that the pilot side will be talking to air traffic control, and the observer side will be talking on the CAP radio COM3. There is a version that's 1 and 2 that can sometimes be helpful if, maybe pilot's talking to air traffic control and the mission observer is talking to flight service. In that case, you want to make sure to remember to monitor channel 3, COM3, which is the CAP radio. That button is in the middle of the bottom row on the right-hand side of the receiver selectors. It says COM3 there. This is a common thing that people do is they switch the mic selector and stop listening to COM3. As an observer, please don't do this, because if the base calls you, you won't hear it. This is an incredibly complex piece of gear, I think, but it really is set up for our mission scenario. This is really how we can get everything done the way we'd like to. This is an incredibly complex matrix of the various combinations. You can see the first couple are sort of simple. When the mic selector is on COM1, in normal mode, both the pilot and the observer will be transmitting on COM1. Same for 2 and 3. In swap mode, if you have the mic selector in COM1, they'll both be transmitting on COM2. COM3 does not have a swap mode. If you're on COM3, you're both on the CAP radio. The one that's more important to us is probably the second from the bottom, which is split 1 and 3. In the normal mode, the pilot side will be on airband COM1. The observer will be on CAP radio COM3. You could swap them. Maybe there's a case where somehow the interaction between the base and the observer is not going well, and the pilot would like to talk to the base, but not give up monitoring and maybe even interacting on COM1. You might do that. I think it's pretty rare. There's also isolation modes. Typically will be on the middle one, which is called all. And the idea is that everybody hears everything the way it should be. The intercom will go to all crew members. Transmit function on the one side will be for the pilot and the other side will be for the observer. There is an isolate mode, which allows the pilot to stop listening to the intercom and radio selection for the observer and the scanner. The observer and the scanner always stay together. Pilot may have some important interaction they're having with air traffic control. Maybe the observer side is very busy interacting with the base. In order to maintain situational awareness and keep the chaos down, the pilot can go into isolate mode. The important thing there is to remember that happened, and after the chaos has died down, get back to all. Very rarely they have an item called crew. I think it's a misnomer. Everybody in a CAP aircraft is part of the crew. But what this means is it's just the front seats that are isolated from the back seat. Try not to do that to your scanner. You probably never will, but that functionality is in there. In the newer aircraft, the G1000, it's a little easier because each of the 2 front seats has its own audio panel, lots of buttons, but the important ones up at the top there, the left-hand side buttons is the microphone selector, and the right-hand column is the receiver selector. The important thing to watch out for here is that you select the microphone you want to transmit on, and the receiver will automatically become engaged. If you switch from COM1 to COM3, it will actually turn off the reception of COM1. So keep an eye on the indicators, make sure that the buttons that you're pushing do exactly what you want it to do. The volume and squelch is independent between the left side and the right side. So feel free to make those changes that are appropriate. Make sure any changes that you do in coordination with the back seat, because again, the back seat follows the observer. The isolation buttons are just above the volume. Pretty rare for the observer to call for isolation. It's usually the pilot that does it. Again, those indicators can tell you whether or not that's something that actually happened, so that you can get back to it once the chaos goes down. The CAP radio is a little different than a lot of radios you may have seen. It has 2 indicator displays, an upper and a lower. These are connected to separate transmitters and receivers. The top one has the full complement of whatever code plug has been programmed into it. You can get to any channel on the code plug, and usually there's a flimsy in the aircraft that will tell you what the code plug looks like. Become familiar with that while you're on the ground, because you may be asked to change channels in the air, and that's a terrible time to come up with that. The bottom one is sort of a special purpose. It has only 2 channels programmed into it. One of them is the guard channel, cap guard, which is the normal position for this to be in. The other one is TAC 1, which is a simplex channel that can be used air to air or air to ground. This is where you'll be spending your time in grid and participating with other cap assets. The normal settings here are shown. These 3 switches at the bottom left are the critical ones. The first one between main and guard. The up position means that when you transmit, you'll be transmitting on the upper display channel. When it's in the down position, you'll be transmitting on the lower displayed value. The second switch between guard 1 and guard 2 changes the lower register between the cap guard and TAC 1. So that's how you control which one of those 2 you're doing. There's a high and a low power switch. Normally we'll leave it in the high position. Very few cases where you'd want to bring it down to low power, but it's more of an advanced topic. The 4 and the 6 key can be used to scroll between channels on the upper register. The 2 and the 8 key with the up and down arrows changes the brightness of the display. There's more to it than this, obviously. Volume controls for the main and guard, upper and lower, are independent. Some of these radios actually have an off switch all the way to the left. On the main, I like to start off with those indicators in the middle and then adjust them for comfort later. So one implication here is that you're going to hear transmissions on both of these channels, regardless of which one is being transmitted on. And so one of the things you're going to want to try to do is get in the habit of, when you hear squelch being broken, turn and look at the display to see which of the upper or lower you're listening to, so that if you have to respond, you'll make sure to respond on the correct one. There are an awful lot of radios in a cap aircraft, more than usual, so that's a critical skill, is to understand which one you're hearing. Especially when things get more chaotic, you're going to need to fall back on this physical approach of looking at the radio to see which indicator light is on. This talks a little bit about switching between G1 and G2. This typically happens when you've switched from being en route to a search objective and are beginning to interact with the other field units out there. Switching between main and guard is just a question of whether you're talking to the field unit or talking to the base on the repeater. Stuck mic is a problem. We like to say that the most precious resource we have on the radio is dead air. If you're using the radio, no one else can. And so part of that means being succinct and clear, but a stuck microphone can ruin everyone's day because it takes up the channel and no information is being passed. So here are some tips on how to recognize whether or not there's a stuck mic involved, because it might be you, it might be the pilot. It might even be the scanner in the back seat. Typically, a symbol like a T will show up on the indicator, remains illuminated during transmissions. There's a transmit LED on the older panel as well. If you don't receive a reply to your transmission, it might be because there's a stuck mic. There's also, sometimes you can notice this because there's a difference between the background noise. A lot of times when you're transmitting, the side tone in your headset may sound differently. So that's also something that can give you a clue that there's a stuck mic. Whack it, jiggle it, whatever you need to do. You might actually need to turn the radio off and back on again when this comes up. Let's talk about radio reports. So you want to make sure that almost immediately before you take off, certainly, that you do a radio check to make sure your radio is working. The radio is there because when we send field units out, we need the information to come back in a timely and accurate way to the base. If your radio is not working, it's probably not a great idea to go at all. So make sure that you do a radio check almost immediately. The minimum required reports are your takeoff time. We want to know when you're in the air back in the base. Your time entering the search area, which may happen more than once. It may also happen immediately. So for instance, we've had missions where the search objective was at the airport, and so you become in grid almost immediately. The time when you've exited the search area, this gives a good indication to the base staff what phase of flight you're in. And then finally, your landing time, wheels down, we call that. Also, when there's nothing to report, we still want to hear from you and want to make sure that you're still in contact and we can get in contact with you. So there's a concept called operations normal or ops normals. These are typically at the top and bottom of the hour, but they can be different on a permission basis. It's really up to the incident commander and the communications unit leader to come up with this plan. So make sure you're part of the briefing so you know what the ops normal tempo is. Some reminders that the radio is a primary link to the air traffic control system. The most important part of pilot to controller communications is understanding. Brevity is important and professionalism is important. Remember that other people are listening to you, but also remember that controllers are human and they respond to professionals differently than they do to non-professionals. As an observer, especially when you're in one of the older aircraft with the PM 7000 audio panel, make sure that there's good communication between the observer and the pilot when you change any of those settings. Don't surprise your boss. Also, the pilot might have just been about to make a radio call, and if you change something that screws them up, that's going to lead to a decrease in performance. So make sure you're communicating to each other. Just a few items about technique. Make sure you're on the right frequency. Make sure the volume's correct. Think about what you're going to say before you transmit. Listen before transmitting. Make sure you're not stepping on somebody and it's your turn to go. Keep the mic. Pause briefly before talking. Pause briefly before stop talking. This is more for air traffic control. Hopefully you pilots are pretty good at the radio by now. Obviously who you're calling, who you are, where you are, and what your request is. We have some techniques that are a little different on the CAP radio side, but there's no slide about it, so that's good. In-flight services, you can get weather information before or after takeoff. This kind of thing is sort of becoming less important these days, but it's still good to know how to do it. It's a great thing for an observer to do during cruise when there's not much else going on. I saw a question come in there. Is the observer responsible for giving engine start and shutdown times to the FRO? Can that be done with the CAP radio? So let me say the word responsible is of particular importance to me. The observer, as the mission commander, is responsible for everything other than the getting to and from safely and legally. Does that mean they have to do it? Not clear. They have to make sure it happens. And whether that's text message, whether that's a contact over the radio, sometimes we have these satellite deals. You can do that. Maybe you can get the scanner to do it. So it's responsible for it happening, but not necessarily responsible for actually doing it. In-flight services, there's some ways you can get some weather en route by listening in to these remote transmitters. They also typically have wide area coverage. It's one way to try to figure out if you get handed off incorrectly or lost contact with a sector that you were talking to, get some help for those kinds of things. ATIS, this is a broadcast that's continually transmitted at airports with actual weather information, updated at least hourly within a couple of minutes of situations changing. You can find the frequency on the sectional, you can find it in the AFD, get to know these things and know what's available there. AWOS is an automated weather observation system. These are typically at smaller airports. It's got all the critical information, when the information was valid, wind speed, direction, and gusts. Very important regulatory for CAP is knowing the wind speed, altimeter settings, and density altitude if it's different more than 1,000 feet. This is just another type of automated information. ASOS, same kind of deal. Might also be able to get it by telephone. Pilot reports. It's useful to other pilots. The information when you deliver one should include the type of aircraft, your location, cloud types, tops, layers, visibility, precipitation, temperature, and wind. Like I said, a lot of times you're actually too busy to do stuff like this, but on maybe a long RTB, you might want to do one of these. It's good to know how to do them at least. Okay, any questions?